Hi, I'm Jennifer Cohn, and I'm here today with Chris Sautter, who is an attorney for the nonprofit election integrity organization Audit USA. He is also a former political consultant to former President Barack Obama, and he has a lot of experience handling recounts. He was involved in the Florida recount. Hi, Chris. Thank you for being here today.
Nice to see you, Jennifer. Thanks for inviting me.
Nice to see you. So you just reached a legal stipulation with some Florida counties in a election transparency lawsuit in Florida. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Terrific. I really want to talk about that, but first I sort of wanted to give a little background to those who are listening to this video about why we have so many transparency concerns in the swing state of Florida and historically what those concerns have involved. So sort of if you could run us through beginning with the Florida recount in 2000.
Well, the Florida recount in 2000, hopefully that's a one-off. We had voting equipment that was antiquated. We had a lack of standards on how to count when there were questions of voter intent. And in Florida since then, they've gone through two modes of voting before they got where they are now. First they had DREs, and there was a debacle in the 13th Congressional District in 2006.
Oh, I want to hear about that, but can you first explain what a DRE is? Because a lot of people don't know.
That's the touchscreen, sort of like the bank touchscreen system. There's no, at that time with that particular system and with most of the systems, there's no paper trail, so there was no way to verify the results. And it was the proverbial black box. And after that disaster, in which roughly 16,000 votes apparently disappeared.
What was this? What race was this?
This is a congressional race in 2006 in the 13th district. And there was a candidate, a Democratic candidate, who in her home county, there was a very high, an unusually high number of no votes in her race. Some 16,000, what we call undervotes, way fewer than all the other races.
An undervote means they selected nobody. They said, we don't want you.
No apparent vote for that particular race. And it was never, it was taken to court. The court did not side with the Democrat who was challenging the system. Congress, the newly elected Democratic Congress in early 2007 chose not to take it up.
Can I interrupt for just 1 sec? I'm sorry, but what was she seeking if there was no paper? Was she seeking a forensic analysis of the equipment?
Yeah, she
okay.
was.
And they probably denied it on the basis that it was proprietary to the vendor. Is that?
That's exactly correct.
That's what happened with John Kerry as well in 2004. Is that right? Before the election, they sought to look at the equipment?
Yes, a lot of similarities there. And so to his credit, Governor Chris, who at that time.
Oops, I lost your sound. Sorry.
What? You have me now?
Yeah, I do. Keep going. So,
okay. To his credit, Governor Christ, who at that time was a Republican, now he's a Democratic member of Congress.
Oh, interesting.
He ordered all of the DREs removed. He basically, just as they had banned the punch cards, they banned the DREs.
Oh,
and
good.
they brought in the optical scan, which everybody seemed to be a fan of. But unbeknownst, I guess, to many, if not most of the election officials, the optical scan move to a new generation of digital scan. But the supervisors of elections in Florida and the legislators are still treating them as if they are optical scan.
And can I just pause for 1 second there? So in general, scanners is sort of the least amount, scanners counting hand-marked paper ballots is the least amount of hackable electronic equipment really possible. So if you're going to use any equipment at all, that's kind of the recommended approach, is to have scanners. And when you say, so they did have the hand-marked paper ballots, and they do have, for the most part.
They do. They're 100%.
Yeah.
100% of Florida is now digital, paper ballots, and
hand-marked paper ballots, though, right? Not the kind.
Paper ballots. And Florida was actually sort of in the vanguard of getting rid of these DREs because they had had such a bad experience with it. But after they did that, they haven't really moved as the technology has moved. And that is sort of the underpinning of our lawsuit, or the problem with our.
Yeah, but if I could pause you right there for just a second, though. It's not only that, though. They also haven't, so they have this record, you know, of hand-marked paper ballots that they could, in theory, hand count to compare against the manual, against the electronic total, to confirm the electronic total. But for the most part, that still doesn't occur.
Well, you know, there are a lot of wrong lessons that are learned from election controversies. And one of the lessons that the legislators in Florida apparently learned was that we shouldn't have to hand count all these ballots, because in 2000, it turned, in their view, it turned the recount into a circus. And so instead, what we should do in recounts is just run the ballots back through the machines and program them so that they kick out the undervotes, those ballots that don't have an apparent mark for the race that's being recounted, or the overvotes where there is the machine does not count a vote because there is apparently 2 marks, and to hand review those. And having just been involved in 2018 in the statewide recounts that occurred, there was the U.S. Senate recount, there was a statewide recount for Commissioner of Agriculture. I'm really up to date on how they proceed, and that's exactly what they did. Although they didn't necessarily run them through the same machines, they brought in most of the big counties, they brought in more of the DS 850s, the big high-speed scanners.
From ES&S, right? They brought
for ES&S, and most 2/3 of the counties, all but 18, I believe, is the number of the counties in Florida. There's 67 counties. All but 18 are ES&S. The other 18, 17, 18 are Dominion. And there's no counties that are hard. Those are the 3 major.
And those are America's 2 largest vendors right there, ES&S, and then second is.
Yeah. And so they, in all of the big counties, all 8 of the defendants in our case are ES&S counties.
Okay, let me ask you a question. You said that Florida decided hand recounts are a disaster and we shouldn't do them. Do you agree with that?
Hardly.
Yeah, okay, I thought that was important to put out there.
Yeah, I was one of the lead lawyers for Al Franken in the Minnesota recount, during which 3 million hand-marked paper ballots were hand recounted, and that was a recount that worked.
Right,
and I can talk about why it worked, but the fact that there were hand-marked paper ballots did not impede the accuracy of that.
Yeah, do you know what the statistic was? I've cited it a bunch of times. I think it's something like that a bipartisan panel agreed to all but 14 out of something like 2.9 million.
Off the top of my head, I can't tell you, but it was, and not to get too far afield here, but the in Minnesota there were, and once again the recount laws emerged from a recount controversy. There was a very hotly contested recount in 1962 for governor, and what happened after that was that a panel was created, much like what was recommended by the Supreme Court in a footnote in Bush v. Gore, in which one body reviewed all contested ballots. That was sort of the rub in Bush v. Gore, is that the at least initially the contested ballots were being resolved by in each county, and so that the argument was that there was no consistent standard. But if you have a single trier of fact trying to resolve these, then presumably they will apply it, whatever the standards are.
People will accept the outcome more too. The other difference, though, of course, is that most of what was recounted in Florida 2000 was punch cards with hanging chads. We're not talking, when we say hand-marked paper ballots, we're not talking about that. We're talking about ballpoint pen. And
well, yes, although actually statewide, most of the ballots were hand-marked paper ballots in Florida, and most of the counties, let me correct myself.
Right. But the ones that caused all the controversy were not.
But the ones that were in South Florida, primarily, those were the punch card counties. And there's a whole history of why populated areas went to punch card, but that was a reality. And it was a flawed method of voting, and there were some procedural problems, and that all compounded to a real problem. And the fact that it was so difficult lent opportunity to those that wanted to discredit the process. I had actually been involved in a number of recounts with punch cards in which there was no controversy, although I was also involved in one where there was a lot of controversy. So before 2000, there had been dozens of recounts with punch cards with no problems.
Well, wasn't there was a big expose that Dan Rather did sometime after 2000, where representatives from Sequoia said that they used, their higher ups had ordered a different type of paper stock that they all knew was going to cause problems. And sort of the insinuation was that maybe it was deliberate.
Yeah,
that right?
Well, that is, I've heard that. I don't know that for a fact, but I've seen that report. There were a lot of problems with the punch card system, and in South Florida, one of the problems was also election administration. They didn't clean out the chads from the previous election, so that it was more difficult to. That combined with the paper stock that was thicker, whatever their intent was, it made it more difficult to penetrate and to record your vote by knocking out the chads, a combination of things.
Yeah, I just want to mention too, just so it doesn't, I don't just mention Sequoia, that there was an expose, a really good ebook by, well, Who What Why published it. I can't remember the name of the author, but it was about democracy stolen, or, it had that type of a title. And in it, the author said that he and someone else had discovered that ES&S actually supplied a lot of the punch cards to Florida too, even though they had made statements that made it appear that they hadn't. When you really got down to it, it turns out that they had. And he felt there were concerns with how the holes were cut, and the idea being that you could also rig the punch cards by making the holes easier or harder to dislodge. Anyway, so we're not talking about using punch cards.
ES&S back then was a rather small operation compared to a couple of the others. It's only been in recent years that it's become this giant that controls most of the market.
Right. So, all right, I actually do want to hear just a little bit more about the Al Franken recount, because as far as that's the only recount that a Democrat has ever successfully or has ever pursued through actually doing or through actually getting a recount. Is that I know of? Are there other?
Well, the Washington State gubernatorial recount in 2004, Christine Gregoire.
Oh,
Is that? Yeah, 2004, Christine Gregoire. She was down a little over 100 votes certified. And they were able to turn that around, and she narrowly won by a little over 100 votes. So
oh wow.
that's another one. I was involved also in the 1984-85 House recount in southern Indiana.
Wow.
And I like to say that almost all the issues in 2000 were present in that, where you had African Americans who were disenfranchised, large number, several thousand, and you
How
had
are they disenfranchised?
well,
Every which way, but
yeah. What happened was during the state recount, Indiana had very strict laws that required a poll worker, Democratic poll worker and Republican poll worker, to initial every ballot, ostensibly to protect against fraud. But in the African American precincts in Evansville, Indiana, that wasn't why they didn't have two sets of initials, I don't know. But several thousands of ballots were tossed out because of that, because of a strict application of Indiana law. And so you had that problem. It was a different reason why they were disenfranchised, but it was the same result, where
right.
Several thousand black voters had their ballots, which were initially counted on election night because they just ran them through the punch card machines. Then during the state recount, they weren't counted. And then there was the House ordered another recount, and they hand counted using GAO auditors. They hand counted every ballot that was cast in that district. And the winner, the Democrat, who was the initial loser in the recount by, I think, 400 votes, won by 4 votes.
Whoa.
And again, not to get too deep into something that's happened a long time ago, but
I think it's fascinating.
That controversy was the beginning of the rise of Newt Gingrich, who at that time was a backbencher who used the issue to claim that the seat had been stolen. It was also the rise of myself, because that was my first recount. And the Republicans targeted that race as the #1 race in the country, and I was the manager of the rematch, which we won. So I was then on my way to a career in politics. Before that, I was a legal services lawyer representing poor people in southern Indiana.
Were you involved at all in the Kerry campaign and their decision not involved as in, but were you privy to those conversations is what I meant? No. What about in 2016? Do you have any insider information on why they didn't seek a recount there?
You mean why the Clinton people did not? I think they were stunned. She didn't want to look like a sore loser.
Yeah, did you hear? You didn't hear that from her, though.
Pardon?
You didn't hear that from her, though. I mean, what I actually heard is that there was a lot of pressure on her to concede. I've heard that from people who would know.
Well, yeah, but I was getting more.
From the existing administration and the Democrats.
Oh, from Obama people.
And the Democratic Party, the DNC, did not back her up at all, is what I have heard. But
yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I mean, I think there was a lot of difference of opinion. It's clear, we talk about grassroots. What happened in that particular case was that the activists not necessarily Clinton fans, but probably many of them people who voted for Hillary Clinton, demanded accountability. And what we got instead was a lesson on how state laws prevent accountability.
Yep, that was the recount because yes, Wisconsin, left it to the counties whether to hand recount, and most of them said no. And
yeah, which is kind of a basic Bush v. Gore problem, where you got different counties applying different rules. You know, I was there with John Brakey. We attended many recounts. It's a big state, and they were conducting their recounts simultaneously. So it was difficult to get to too many, but we did go to Milwaukee County, which is the largest in the state. We went to Dane County, which is where Madison is. We went to several others.
Weren't most of those done by machine though, or not Milwaukee?
Well, Dane County was done by hand.
Okay.
Madison. You know, Madison, of course, is a different place. And now Madison is one of those few places in the country that posts ballot images online. And that happened, not to toot my own horn, but that happened because of conversation that John and I had with the clerk. And we persuaded him. We said this would be a really good thing for the voters and the public and for you politically. He did.
So let's explain what a ballot image is for those who don't know.
Well,
The heart of the matter.
Yeah. Scanners in jurisdictions that use hand-marked paper ballots are increasingly digital. The digital have replaced the optical scan. In Florida, for example, in 2018, there were still 3 counties that were optical scan. Now there are none. So every single county in Florida is hand-marked paper ballot that are read, counted, if you will, by digital scanners. So what happens is when a voter takes his or her ballot and puts it through the scanner, it takes a picture, front and back, which creates what we call digital image. It's a picture. It's a absolute replicate of the ballot. And it is that image through the counting system, which is counted, not the paper ballot. And this creates a dichotomy because under the laws in virtually every state, the paper ballot, which is the ballot which is filled out by the voter, is the original public record. The ballot image is unique. It is in the chain of custody of the vote, which means that, you know, from the chain of custody of the vote is that the voter checks in, gets the ballot, fills out the ballot, and then runs it through the machine. And the machine, the ballot image is a integral part of the system to count the vote. So our position has been that these digital ballots are public records, which should be kept just like all election materials, election records, if you will, whether it is a paper ballot, whether it's a mail-in or absentee envelope, whether it is a duplicate ballot. Sometimes ballots come in the mail and they get damaged, and the election officials have to complete a duplicate ballot in order to run it through the scanner. Both of those documents, records, have to be kept. And that requirement originated in federal law as a part of the 1960 Civil Rights Act, back at a time when African Americans were trying to register to vote. They would fill out a registration. The registration would get tossed out. The Justice Department would come in and say, this person signed an affidavit saying they registered to vote, but their name's not on the rolls. And they said, well, we have no record of it. So, and this is actually under Eisenhower, 1960.
Interesting.
So
Wow.
that was a part of the Civil Rights Act to require that those records and all other election materials be kept for 22 months following a federal election. Virtually every state has a law or a regulation that also requires election materials to be kept for 22 months. So in most cases, there is a federal and a state requirement to keep all election records. So the real,
isn't there also a requirement just to keep government records? Because it seems like, how emails have to be preserved if it's done for government business. Those are digital records and they have to be preserved. It just makes sense.
Yes. So this is, our argument is this is a public record that must be kept. And, if you file a public records request or in the course of a recount, you can ask for discovery and quickly get that. What are the advantages of a ballot image in a recount? Well, you can, to go through the paper ballots to find something, an issue, it's like you're looking for a needle in a haystack. With ballot images, you can resolve a question in a matter of minutes. Let me give you a couple examples. In 2018 in Broward County, the infamous, I should say, Broward County, Florida, in between running the ballots through the high-speed scanners for the original count and the recount, 2,040 ballots couldn't be accounted for. As the supervisor of elections of Broward County said during that recount, they are in the building.
Yeah, that was the infamous Brenda Snipes, who
They're
ostensibly a
in the
Democrat.
building. We just can't find them.
Yeah.
We just can't find them. So ballot images they could have quickly accounted for all the ballots.
Right.
But because they didn't believe that ballot images should be maintained, they had been destroyed, both during the original count and during the recount.
Yeah, it preserves the chain of custody. So yeah, so if ballots somehow disappear between election night and the recount, their images could show that theoretically.
So anyway, that's sort of the basic concept of the ballot images. So we have a little bit of history here. In 2018, John and I and some other folks that are part of John Brakey's organization, Audit USA, and some other folks, we had in September a forum, and we talked to a number of people who were concerned about this. We ended up filing a case in federal court asking that that the ballot images be preserved. Actually, before we filed, we had discussions with the director of elections, Maria Matthews, and her counsel. And they agreed to send out a letter, or email, I should say, to all the supervisors of elections, instructing them to preserve the ballot images.
And what does preserving entail? I'm sorry.
Well, there are a number of ways to preserve. There are flash drives that they can, for the smaller precinct scanners, they can be put on flash drives. Each one of these machines gives election officials a choice. This is one of ES&S's brilliant ideas. Rather than to give them no choice and require that they be preserved, they give them a choice between preserving all. It says save all. There are like 3 different options: save all, save write-ins only, or save none. And throughout Florida in 2018, and I will say throughout virtually every state in the country, election officials are pushing save none
Jesus.
or save write-ins only.
And they're
Depending on
automatically created, is that right? I mean, it's not like
the ballot
you have to
images are
create them.
automatic.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're automatically created. They are created the moment that picture is taken. In other words, the moment the ballot is run through the scanner, the ballot image is created. You
And yet
can't
officials are deleting them?
you can't tabulate, you can't have a vote or votes on a ballot without a ballot image. It's impossible. So some election officials have taken the position that, well, unless you turn it on, there are no ballot images, which is obviously patently false because you don't have a vote unless you have a ballot image.
So they were destroying them, but trying to play some sort of semantic game to pretend that they weren't.
Well, a lot of them didn't even know what they were doing, to be honest.
Okay.
They were, what we have found is in the states when they get instructions from their, either their Secretary of State or their state election, Board of Elections, depending on who actually has the authority to do it, and it varies from state to state, they won't do it because they're still, many of them are still living in the age of optical scan. They don't really even know that there's a, they haven't been educated. And so even though it's in the manuals, but you know, who reads the manuals? They all have consultants. Most of them work for the vendor before they became consultants and decided to cash in on their time at ES&S or wherever they work. So in 2018, the Maria Matthews sent out this email, and immediately the Association of Supervisors of Elections, represented by a guy named Ron Labasky, pushed back in a big way. And a day later, she sent out a corrective email, which basically eviscerated her prior instructions. So then we filed suit. And in federal court, they filed a motion to dismiss on the grounds that there's no private right of action in the federal statute. And we filed under federal and state law, but we're in federal court, and under the federal rules, if you don't have a viable federal claim, you don't have a viable state claim.
And your claim is that you want them to preserve the images that are automatically created, and they're saying we don't have to, and we're going to kick you out of court on a procedural issue.
Well, that's what they did. They said there's no, the procedural issue was they hadn't actually even filed an answer. They just filed a motion to dismiss.
Right.
And they said that there was no private right of action. We got a very good judge, Mark Walker, who has ruled on several other cases in ways that are very favorable to voters. He ruled against us, but he had some language that in effect said, I hope you file this in state court because this is a good issue. Yeah, I think you're right, but you're in the wrong venue.
Okay.
So then we spent a lot of time in the off year educating the supervisors of elections. By we, I should give credit primarily to Susan Pinchon, who is a plaintiff in both cases, the federal case and now the state case, but also is the head of the Florida Election Alliance, or I forget the exact name, but she is a longtime advocate in Florida and
That's
has
right.
been involved in many important battles, including this battle going back to 2006 with the DREs that were problematic.
Interesting. Yeah, she's terrific.
So she went around and she managed almost single-handedly to persuade 32 supervisors. There were a couple that were already doing it, but to persuade at least 24 on her own to start to preserve the ballot images.
Wow. Great.
There were some that were already doing it. Her home county, she started in her home county, Volusia County, That's outside. Um, are you hearing that interference?
It's okay. It's only just a tiny bit. It isn't a big
Um,
deal.
and so we're up to 32 counties now out of 67 that are preserving ballot images. So on July 1st, with pretty much the same lineup, of plaintiffs, except we added the three legislators, including Joe Geller, who is a state representative from the Miami-Dade area, Miami-Dade County, and a couple others from other counties, I think Orange County, a state senator, another state rep, and the Florida Democratic County. And one of our plaintiffs is a Republican, so it's actually a bipartisan
That's good. That's good.
group. And we brought it under the state public records law, but we referenced the federal law. In other words, we said they've got this duty under federal law to preserve these ballot images, and we have the right to have access to those ballot images, which is being denied because they're being destroyed by the defendants. The defendants are 8 supervisors of elections in the 8 most populous counties, and they constitute 55% of the vote. When you add those 8 counties plus the 32 counties, you've got 80% of the vote that are going to be preserving for the presidential election. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's many more by the time we get to November 3rd.
So what are the 8 counties, by the way, that were the defendants?
No, I was afraid you'd ask me that.
It's just some of them anyway.
Broward County, obviously.
Right.
Broward County, Miami-Dade, the ones with a history of problems.
Okay, great.
Miami-Dade, let's see.
I think
Orange
Palm Beach is in there, isn't it?
Palm Beach, Hillsborough, Pinellas, which is St. Petersburg, the 8th most populous. The 9th
okay, got it. Yeah, I can look at it.
The 9th most populous is the county where Susan Pinchot lives, which is Volusia. And she was able to persuade them to start preserving, which to some extent contradicts their argument that the large counties don't have the ability to preserve because it'll disrupt their administration of the election.
Okay, and so can you tell me exactly what that you reached?
What the what is?
What the stipulation says that you reached earlier.
So,
it was earlier in this week, right?
We had an oral argument on August 7th,
Mm-hmm.
and on our side, Ben Cooney, 3 out of our 4 lawyers are veterans of the 2000 recount.
In Florida, yep.
Yeah, and one of the first things I did when John and I decided we needed to explore bringing legal action is I got in contact with some of the lawyers I worked with in 2000. And one of the most impressive is a guy by the name of Ben Cooney, Kuehne, out of Miami-Dade, who is primarily a criminal lawyer, but he has been involved in election issues for decades. He's a brilliant guy, and he was the first guy I spoke to, and he was also the lead lawyer on the federal case. But Joe Geller, who's the state legislator, is both a plaintiff and a lawyer in the case.
Okay, great,
and
that's
a guy named
helpful.
Mark Burton, who was the Democratic Party's head of voter protection in 2018, a young lawyer, but
Great.
really smart guy. So that's the legal team down there.
Okay.
And Ben Cooney argued against the motion to dismiss. Judge Dodson, we filed it in Leon County, which is Tallahassee.
Mm-hmm.
The argument basically was the supervisors of elections claimed that there is a series of cases that requires when you sue somebody, a county official, you have to sue them in their home county.
Okay.
But there's exceptions to that, one of which is
Right.
if you sue several and you sue one in one of the home counties, then you're okay, which is what we did. The Secretary of State's home county is Leon County, which is
Got
where
it.
Tallahassee is. Their argument was, well, that's a state defendant, not a county defendant, but the court didn't buy it. Unfortunately, they are now appealing. And with that appeal, traditionally, I don't think it's legally required, but traditionally, a stay is issued by the Court of Appeals. We, the plaintiffs, feared that we weren't going to be able to hear the case before the election anyway, so we initiated this stipulation. We proposed that that the action be pushed back after the election in exchange for an agreement to preserve ballot images in the event of a presidential recount. And our argument was that your concerns, though we don't agree that they're valid, your concerns about election administration don't apply in a recount because you're running the ballots through just to count one race. And you're also running all the ballots through the high-speed scanners, not through the slower precinct scanners. So they agreed to it.
And so you'll get the images from the recount. So you're going to have like a check on the, if there's a recount, you'd have a check, a way to public records request those images.
The 2 points are they have to preserve and they have to make them available.
Great. Okay. Well, that is.
So that's, I view that as an important step.
I think it is an important step.
I'm not naive to think that the battle is won.
No.
But it's an important step. Anytime, really, that was our fundamental concern over all others was another presidential recount without this backup system of ballot images.
That's true. Yes, if there's
so we're very happy
people will
with
be poring over those images.
We still have to try the case. Part of the stipulation is we can't reinitiate the case before November 17th, which is 2 weeks after November 3rd.
Right.
But, obviously we can move ahead then. So we will.
That is great. Thank you. It's so important to bring some transparency to a process that is not transparent in the state of Florida. And unfortunately, in too many states, it's not transparent. I also just wanted to point out, I think Florida has me really concerned. Florida, Wisconsin, and Michigan all have me concerned because although all 3 of those states do have those hand-marked paper ballots, I don't think any of them has meaningful manual audit laws, and they don't have transparency. And all 3 of those battleground states have allowed ES&S to install or provide for installation wireless modems in ES&S precinct ballot scanners in some and perhaps many or most of their counties. And those those wireless modems connect to the internet. This has been reported on the news and mostly in the written media. It really hasn't received as much attention as it should. So I'm really glad that and grateful for your work to provide some transparency to the process. Thank you. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you would like to mention?
Well, I would mention that Audit USA is involved in several other of the battleground states. We're involved in Arizona, where there has been real progress as a result of John Brakey's longtime activism. Before Audit Elections USA was a national organization, it was Audit Arizona. And through John's determination, they have made a number of changes, and also because of the debacle in 2016 where the 2016 presidential primary, where they had 6-7 hour lines because they'd closed polling stations, and 22,000 provisional ballots were tossed out.
Why were they tossed out? I didn't know that.
Well, these things are always complicated, but and I don't know that we got a total accounting, but Arizona had this odd law, which I believe they've since fixed, that there were two separate tracks. Just because you are registered as a Democrat for state purposes didn't mean you were registered for purposes of voting in the Democratic primary. So people would show up knowing that they were registered to vote as a Democrat, only they hadn't been assigned as Democrats. They hadn't specifically declared the purpose of the presidential primary. So that was one of the reasons, but there were many more. Their whole system of registration was screwed up, so that people who tried to register in the last couple of weeks before the deadline were stamped as being registered after the deadline.
Oh, okay.
So thousands of people. Some of that was Bureau of Motor Vehicles. Some of it was Department of Elections. So that was all screwed up. But the bigger picture is that because it was so badly run, the conservative Secretary of State and the conservative clerk in Maricopa County, which is Phoenix, were tossed out, and they were replaced by progressive Democrats. So the Secretary of State, and I think this is important, not just in Arizona, but a couple other states that I'll mention in a minute. Secretary of State in Arizona is sympathetic, I will say. I mean, you know, there's always a test to see how sympathetic they are.
Right.
But they, at least they're on record of trying to make every vote count, and not involved in this gratuitous purging that we saw in Georgia and we've seen in other states, Wisconsin and some other states.
Blunt force purging, yep.
We also have a fairly progressive Secretary of State in Michigan with a Democratic governor, very progressive Attorney General, and progressive Secretary of State. So the three most important offices as far as counting presidential ballot in Michigan are now Democrats, whereas 4 years ago they were Republicans.
Well, that's something to feel a little bit better about.
We have claims to be a progressive governor in Pennsylvania. We have a pretty good governor in Wisconsin. Well, again, a little bit different than Michigan.
Well, they haven't done anything about that. Well, this isn't Pennsylvania, but the Michigan, she's a Democrat, and there was an article where she said she would ask her committee whether to remove the modems, and if they recommended removing them, they'd be removed. And that's the last we heard. That was many months ago.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So sometimes these people are tested, and their deeds don't parallel their words. But we'll see. But no matter what you think about Gretchen Whitmer or the governor of Pennsylvania, it is better than having, or the governor of Wisconsin.
And
they're better than what we've had before.
And even the governor, and even well, the Secretary of State of Michigan, at least she is a Democrat.
Yeah. So you know, I'm somewhat more optimistic if there are real problems there. But the real problems in those states are the state laws. And, you know, we saw this, you alluded to it in Wisconsin, where you had, I think that they should have gone into federal court and argued Bush v. Gore, but they didn't, the Stein lawyers in 2016. But you had, for the most part, you had good judges hearing the case, asking that they require that that there be a hand count of all hand-marked paper ballots in Wisconsin, and still it didn't happen.
What would arguing Bush v. Gore have meant? Just that everything had to be done the same, a uniform process?
Yeah, I know the court said this is a one-time decision, but the fundamental decision of Bush v. Gore is like ballots have to be treated in a like manner. If it stands for nothing else, it stands for that. And for the most part, states are moving in that direction. Things were pretty chaotic. There was no real roadmap on how to deal with a presidential recount before 2000. I think things are better with Bush v. Gore. I don't
If
like.
they'd argued Bush v. Gore, though, couldn't the result have just been that everything would have been machine recounted? Which isn't really.
Back then, no. Back then, everything had to be a hand count.
No, but I mean, if they had argued that in Wisconsin, arguing I thought.
Well, they argued for a hand count because some counties, I think, had already voted for a hand count. Not that a ruling was
Okay.
ruling, but I think Dane County recount might have already been underway. I don't know, but you're right. There's always a risk that when you are going for something, that you end up getting something worse than you would have.
Yeah, you're going for uniformity, and you get uniformly awful instead of uniformly good.
But I think if you'd gone into federal court, yeah, they would have stood a better chance. But
Interesting.
you know, it's always easier to look back and criticize. And they did have a good judge in that case. By good, I mean with a pretty good track record, and they just win. So, you know, 2016, I think, was cautionary in the sense that the laws are bad, and they're still bad in all three.
Can you explain Michigan law? That Michigan law was just terrible. It's like it excluded everything from the recount that you would want to include in a recount. Everything that looks suspicious, the law said, let's exclude that.
Well, what it was, one of the problems, there were a number of problems, but one of the problems was that if in the recount, if the numbers don't reconcile, in other words, if the number of people who signed into the vote don't exactly equal the number of votes of ballots that are counted, then the whole precinct gets tossed out.
And of course, that would be a precinct you'd normally want to look at.
Yeah, now we all know, anybody involved in elections knows that they miss a few. But Detroit being Detroit, there were some precincts where there were more than a few.
Mm-hmm.
And and the law goes back to the days when there was a lot of ballot box stuffing. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. Detroit doesn't have the best record of clean elections, but by being so strict, it really creates a situation where a lot of people are disenfranchised. And but there were problems beyond where you had one or two that were off.
And then they stopped it after 3 days, and Pennsylvania didn't even get a recount at all. So that was unfortunate. I mean, and a lot of the Pennsylvania machines would not have had a reliable paper trail or any paper trail.
No, well, almost the whole state was without paper trail. So to some extent, it would have been a meaningless
exercise.
Recount. It would have been, you know, you would have been able to check what they had, what the machines had printed out, but there would be no independent check. So in that sense, it wouldn't have produced anything meaningful.
Yeah, what they needed, if anything, was a forensic analysis, although unfortunately experts say that hackers can erase all their tracks, but just because they can doesn't necessarily mean they would, so.
Right, you know, robbers make mistakes.
Yep,
They
exactly.
leave fingerprints,
Yep.
and you know, you don't know until you actually analyze it. And but I think the steam, by the time they got these states were,
they were out of steam.
The recounts were going to be conducted sequentially. Wisconsin was first. By the time they got to Pennsylvania, I think the wind was out of their sails.
Yeah, and there wasn't enough public awareness at that point about the risks of hacking. There had been a lot of information spread about, you can't hack a voting machine because they never connect to the internet, which even if they didn't, that would be false. You can absolutely hack machines that aren't directly connected. And
Well, it's much
many
better
of them
now,
did connect.
but many of those false feelings still exist. Um, and, we've seen the proliferation of the ballot marking devices, including in Pennsylvania, where there's the election officials or the people that are buying the equipment are making the same mistakes that they made after the passage of the Help America Vote Act, and they ran out and bought all these DREs, these touchscreen voting machines, where the technology was problematic and there were no paper trails, and they're rushing out under the pressure of these uh, voting machine companies, particularly ES&S, and in some cases there appears to be more than just legal pressure. I mean, there's clearly been a lot of money.
Oh, donations made through lobbyists and otherwise.
Lobbyists, right. And
Yep.
and they've rushed out and done that. Now, it hasn't happened everywhere, but already in Pennsylvania, there have been problems. There was
Yeah, they do have paper. They give a nod to paper, but they still have all the problems of having a touch screen, and experts say it's not a reliable paper trail like a ballpoint pen and paper would be. It's a
exactly. Well,
to be
there
a
are
ballpoint
problems.
pen.
There are problems on the machine end, and there are problems on the scanner end,
Yeah.
and they deny it. And they are election officials are willfully blind to the problems, and some have already begun to learn lessons. And that there was a judicial election last year where one of the um, candidates who was considered to be a leading candidate ended up with like 20 votes or something.
Right on the, but then they claim that, yeah, that was the ES&S Express Vote XL all-in-one machine. So it has the
Right.
balloting device, touchscreen, and the scanner in one unit, which increases complexity and makes it a lot likelier to break down. They had to like rip the machines apart.
One of the things they are, since we've talked so much about recounts, one of their selling points to election officials, and Stephen Rosenfeld, the journalist, got this on record in North Carolina. He interviewed an ES&S representative. He said, well, one of our strongest selling points is that they don't have to worry about recounts.
What? Why would they?
For ballot marking devices. In other words, you're not going to have to deal with, voter intent or, these paper trails or meaning. He more or less acknowledged that what they're trying to do is get beyond verifying the process of having to verify.
Voter
So all they
intent.
have to do is look at it and say, well, that's what it is.
Well, and of course, if you have a machine marked paper trail, you can also, print up an entirely false election, as Benny Smith, another election integrity advocate, once pointed out.
Yeah.
They also take 3 times as long. I think a lot of people assume that using a touch screen somehow speeds up the process. And at least for the Express Vote XL, the Pennsylvania Secretary of State did its own study, and this was reported by Frank in the AP, which showed that they take voters 3 times as long to use as a hand-marked paper ballot and scanner.
Yeah, well, one of the problems, quite frankly, is that many of the people who are involved in the selection and purchasing of this equipment aren't really qualified to do it.
Right.
They like their old DREs. They're disappointed that they had to get rid of them. In Pennsylvania, they were all DREs, and so they were looking for something as close to the DRE as possible, but that passed the Election Assistance Commission's approval, and so that's really what we saw this in North Carolina. They're kind of going for whatever the next generation.
What they're used to, what they're used
Yeah,
to.
these BMDs are next
The
generation
thing is,
DRDs.
touch screens, miscalibration, the vote flipping, you know, on the touch screen, you put one candidate and it flips to the other. There's so many memes about that, and you would just think they would want to move away from that. There was an
They
ES
all blame the voters.
online. I saw him give a pitch in Pennsylvania saying, with these new BMDs, miscalibration is not an issue anymore. Scouts honor. And guess what? Miscalibration was a huge issue in their debut
Yeah.
with in Northampton County and in Philadelphia. They had, I think it was something like a third of the machines were miscalibrated.
Yeah. Well, you know, they are, you know, snake oil salesmen, to be honest. And as I said, too many people involved are not competent, and they sort of view the activists as cranks, and so they just kind of move ahead. And in some cases, they move ahead for spite. You know, they want to prove that they're in charge, and they're not going to
Listen
give
to
in.
activists. Yeah.
They're not going to give in to the activists, and you know,
Those filthy activists. Yeah.
the number of activists is growing, but it's still not at a point where it is creating fear among among people who are elected.
Right. And I think part of the problem is that there has been this groupthink that you have to put public trust in elections ahead of having trustworthy elections. And therefore, we don't discuss these problems in public. If we discuss them at all, it will be behind closed doors. But the problem is that allows misinformation to proliferate. And that's what enables bad decisions about new voting equipment.
Well, I think it is that and more. I think that in many cases, election officials want to control the information. They don't like the idea because they do make mistakes. I know this is
of course they do. They're
really
humans,
true
you know? They're
in
human
Florida,
beings.
in Florida, where you know, mistakes are rampant in high visibility elections. They just make so many mistakes, all of them, and they don't want the transparency because the transparency brings accountability, and they don't want accountability. They want to be able to say, well, this is voter caused. This is not caused by election officials.
Yeah, and you know, I think that the public doesn't necessarily expect perfection, and I think they do expect transparency, and I don't think the average voter still understands that we don't even have it. They don't even know to ask for it. It's not discussed enough. So, you know, we're working on it. And anyway, thank you so much for transparency in court and otherwise. I really appreciate it.
Okay, well, thanks for all you do.
Yeah, oh, you're welcome. Well, it's great talking to you, and we'll.
I love to read your articles. You're one of the few people out there that is really hitting the nail on the head. So, very much appreciate your work.
Wow, that's high compliments from you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'll look forward to seeing what you guys are doing next. So we'll talk soon.
Okay, we'll keep you posted.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Bye.